In this lecture, we're going to be covering chapter 5 of Even the Rat Was White. So this chapter talked about a wide range of things. In particular, it talked about the subjugation of the African slave, and then the struggle for formal education, and then with ending on the creation of historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, as I will refer to the colleges throughout. And then lastly, talking about the role that psychology played in the interest of Black students at these HBCUs. So to start off with, we're going to talk about the first half of the chapter that covered the dehumanizing experience of the African slave. So with colonialism, what you had and what was observed, uh, you had Africans who were brought to the New World and were enslaved. They didn't escape, to be quite frank, compared to the European counterparts. They were enslaved. They were stripped of their cultural identities, self-concept, and languages at the same time. And the reason being for that is that there were a larger amount of African folks than European folks. So there was this recognition that if there's recognition of the excess in numbers, then that would allow for an uprising and to dismantle the whole system. And that was something that could not be had. The African slave at that point in time was a money-making machine. Slavery was essentially an economic, was a very big economic process within the South, and really, to be quite frank, all throughout the United States at that point in time, or what was then the New World. So it would bring money to different parts of Europe, so forth and so on, and even after the American Revolution, still providing a lot of money for the country. So during that point in time, within that experience, the African slave experienced very harsh physical and psychological subjugation. Family units were typically ignored and separated. You had family members being separated from their families through the buying and selling, through the trade process. You also saw a lot of dehumanization, as I just mentioned, but with respect to African men and African women, they're very, very different. So with the male slave, they were least likely to receive reciprocity from the master, and this typically fostered a lot of self-hatred. The only way that a male slave was to be recognized by the slave master was fulfilling the role of the preacher or of an entertainer, roles that where the slave master or really any rich white man could control. So even in engaging in those roles, that person was still being controlled. Now, there was also as far as like moving up, there really wasn't much for that. Typically, for a man, African man, they could move into the house, serving as a valet, a carriage man, a butler, or handyman. So these positions are still serving within the same roles, and not, even though it's considered a little bit better, still what we still see with these positions, they're still limiting in what that person could do. So to be quite frank, while there was quote unquote a step up, and I'm using air quotes on that, even with those positions, there were still subjugations. They were not able to move up. Now with the African woman, her experience was a lot more complex. So she experienced subjugation based upon her race as well as her gender. When it came to Black women, they could not, or they had little opportunity to move up compared to the African man, compared to the Black man. Um, so with Black women, the rape of Black women typically was not recognized as rape. It wasn't legally recognized as rape unless another white man or another slave owner raped this woman. And that was considered like a violation of property, because at that point in time, Black women were not seen as women as well as Black men. They were seen as property. Now, also your book made note that Black women, they could be raped by their slave master, and it would not be seen legally as rape. So taken together, for Black women, Black women were treated as property, and they were seen as they were objectified, is the point. And with Black women, whenever they would birth their children would be taken from them, sold off to another slave master, or they would be raised in bondage with her. A lot of times the Black woman fought to keep the children with her, and sometimes she was beaten, and in other times they were kept together as a family. But there was always this uncertainty that would not always be the case. So with Black women, when it also came to children, they became nursemaids or surrogate parents for like the master's kids. And a lot of times, because they were taking care of the master's children, it often put the duty would often require that the slave would put off on their own children. So while Black women were taking care of the master's children, their own children were being ignored, or well, yes, being ignored, as well as like given a job to do. So for the Black kids at that point in time, there really wasn't the kids who were able to walk and talk and hold things, they were also put to work as well. So when it came to Black people as a whole at that point in time, there was a lot of dehumanization at that time. There were little to no opportunities to move up. So for Black folks, there was only so many things that they could do. And your book provided with 3 options. And this is commonly what you've seen, these main, really along these 3 main themes. So the first one is to identify with the slave master. Now, this was a very common coping strategy. It was a way to survive for that slave. And really what it did, what this particular coping strategy did, it incorporated the values and attitudes of that slave master. So where the slave observed the master's triumphs and winnings, they so did as well. They avoided like feeling incompetent. So like they just substituted their master's feelings for their own. So like if the master was happy, they were happy. If the master was sad, they were sad. Um, so really with this particular coping strategy, it really provided that slave to or it allowed the slave to avoid those feelings of inadequacy, experience feelings of safety, um, and overall, this is like this complete acceptance of inferiority. Okay, so this is where you had the stereotypical Uncle Tom and Sambo come up, um, and this is this particular with this particular identification with this particular coping strategy, um, folks typically regarded those slaves as negative, almost as tattletales whenever something was going down and that slave told the slave master. So there's a lot of negative stereotypes associated with this particular coping strategy, but I do want to be clear that in the beginning, there was no slave that was wanting to identify with the slave master. And to be quite frank, this is more along the lines of a coping strategy. Um, it was a survival technique. It allowed people to survive. So you have, or if you've ever seen Django Unchained, um, Samuel Jackson's character in particular, um, that role was related to this particular option. Um, and if we're not recognizing this within historical context, um, we fail to recognize the usefulness and the survival and the allowance of survival based upon this option. So I want to be clear in that was purely a coping strategy, and in some form, in some ways, internalized oppression. Uh, and that was the main point. The point was to survive at that point in time. So that's something really important to remember. And then second option, escape from slave master. So this was a really big deal. So really, with this particular option, slaves ran. And to also give you some context information, typically most of the slaves that did run away were men. Um, African women who were enslaved, they typically stayed behind to care for the children, and a lot of times they did not see their partner again. That partner either was caught and killed, or they made it to the north and were able to be free. So a lot of times you had African women staying at the plantation for their children. And in some cases, when African women did run and they did have a family, they would always come back to get that child. So that's important information for you right there. The way that this escape happened, there are a lot of spirituals and reliance on the stars, celestial navigation, if you will, to lead other slaves to freedom. Harriet Tubman in particular, she was, as we know it, one of the like a very, very important figure when it came to escaping from slavery. So with this escape, these reactions, they had reactions from slave masters. You had a lot of slave masters wondering, why would they want to run away? I don't understand it. Well, those who were supporting it, like really, the thing is, those who were supporting slavery had to find a way to explain why these folks are like running away. And granted, the conditions that I provided with y'all in the earlier part of the lecture, answers besides that one. So you had a lot of proponents of slavery trying to figure out why these slaves would run away. And really what came about, you had this turn towards the medical field, or really healthcare. And I mentioned a couple lectures ago, I mentioned drapetomania within the ableism and ageism lecture. So this is where that would come in. Samuel Cartwright coined the term drapetomania to characterize this particular psychological disorder where you had slaves running away, and that was a symptom of this disorder, or that was like the result of that disorder. Um, Cartwright provided some quote unquote symptoms to characterize drapetomania. So he says, before Negroes run away, they become sulky and dissatisfied. The cause of the sulkiness and dissatisfaction should be inquired into and removed, or they are apt to run away and or fall into the Negro consumption. When sulky and dissatisfied without cause, the experience of those on the line and elsewhere was decidedly in favor of whipping them out of it as a preventative measure against absconding or other bad conduct. It was called whipping the devil out of them. So with drapetomania, one of the ways to treat it or prevent it was to whip the slave, okay? And then there was Cartwright's other disorder, dysesthesia aethiopis, which is basically saying that with this particular psychological disorder, slaves would get it if they were treated as free. So when slave masters are kind and treating and treat their slaves nicely, this particular psychological disorder is bound to be bound to occur. Now, in a way of curing it, same way as proposed for drapetomania, whipping. Okay. Now, looking at drapetomania and dysesthesia aethiopis, it's really important to really look at these and critique them on their basis. So this is one part of history of like psychology and psychiatry that was very much involved in the dehumanization of African slaves. For the first part, it was the use of science, use of authority to dehumanize Black people, for starters. And then it also created language and reasoning to basically justify the control of Black folks. And then lastly, you don't typically see these terms within the history of psychology. If you were to open a Psych 102 textbook, not Psych 102, excuse me, Psych 101 textbook or an introductory course textbook of psychology, you wouldn't see these terms. And really, this is more of the uglier history of psychology. And I make an argument that it's really important to understand this uglier side as to not repeat this history. And the removal or the lack of recognition of these particular concepts, and I call them concepts to be nice. It undermines the efforts that was done in psychology to promote the dehumanization of Black and brown people, to be quite frank. So it basically moves us away from recognizing and understanding racism within psychology and psychiatry. So the third option, and one that was very, very aggressive physical attack or fighting the slave master. So during that time period, you did have insurrections. One of the most notable is Nat Turner's insurrection. Really, the way that these insurrections occurred, you had one particular or a couple of slaves who were very literate, who could read, who could write, and they were seen as the leaders of these insurrections. And within these insurrections, there'd be a riot amongst slaves towards the slave masters, and then you ended up with a lot of violence, um, and a lot of people dying. Now, during that time period, in order to prevent insurrections from happening, the Black Codes were passed. And the Black Codes is basically this restriction against formal education, of the slaves. So you did have some slave masters who taught their slaves how to read and how to write, and with these slaves learning how to do that, it showed a lot of people that that the African was not dumb. Instead, it showed that they were very intelligent and capable of being, a human, right? However, because of this hysteria around insurrections and violence among slaves, you had a lot of like paranoid monitoring, about 24/7. So with the Black Codes, that was like the first, I don't want to say it's the first, but it's more along the lines of, the documented history of struggling for formal education of slaves. So the Black Codes restricted very heavily for African slaves. Now, for those who were free, they weren't restricted at all by these codes, but it still was a struggle for them to receive formal education. You had some free folk go towards the North, and even though the North was a little bit more accepting than the South, there still was prejudice and discrimination. And you had some Black children who were trying to go to these schools, trying to get educated. They were stoned, they were made fun of. So in some cases, you also had like teachers being whipped for teaching these children. So the point is, getting a formal education as a Black American at that point in time was a struggle. Now, because of course the legal restrictions and because of stigmatization, there were a couple of opportunities that Black folk could get their education. So makeshift schools. So some slaves, like the ones who were able to read and write, were able to make like these secret night makeshift schools, and they teach other slaves at that point in time. There's also publications like from Northern societies that if they got their hands on, they'd read that. One of the big ones is Bibles. So with the Bible in particular, there were certain passages that were preached to the slaves, but as slaves began to learn how to read and how to write, they used the Bible to expand on their words. And as a result, they were able to read the Bible and recognize that slavery in and of itself was wrong. They were able to find passages that were not in support of slavery. Really big deal. And then also there were some textbook materials that would be laying around. Now these textbook materials, they weren't as good as the materials within the schools, but they were supplementary. They were good enough. And then lastly, you had some African Americans go overseas to schools. You had a lot of them going to English and Scottish schools. Now, to be quite clear, I said a lot. A only by the time that the Emancipation Proclamation occurred, approximately 40 Black men and women were able to get a college degree. That's a big deal. That's like while we look at it as rare, it was a big deal back then, because it meant that there's something that they are moving forward. Now, during the Civil War, you saw that. You had a lot of Black folks fighting in the Civil War for the Confederation and for the Confederacy and for the Union. But you also had a lot of Blacks on both sides reading and writing. So after the war, what you saw was a push for formal education, specifically higher education at that. So you had those makeshift night schools. They were turned into day schools, and at that time, with funding, you had these Black colleges. Excuse me. And these were the HBCUs, the historically Black college and universities. Excuse me. And they were typically established by like white American association, missionary associations, and Freedmen's Aid Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church. So you have a lot of Christian groups, all white Christian groups, and very rich Christian groups at that. This is like beyond the scope of your. This is beyond the scope of your the book. You had a lot of like rich white people funding these Black colleges as well, and that's something that's important to remember. My old institution, Xavier University of Louisiana, it was founded by St. Catherine Drexel, and St. Catherine Drexel was a wealthy white woman, and she established different schools for Black and brown folks. The elementary and middle school that I went to was also established by her. So you had, to be quite clear, while you did have a lot of racism conducted by a lot of rich white folks, you also had some white folks that were, rich white folks in particular, that were like, hey, slavery is bad. We need to like abolish this. And like you had people following through with like their own stuff, to be quite frank. And even the government was becoming a little bit more accepting of formal education for Black folks, in particular land grant provisions. So with that, basically it established like the state supported institutions. So thinking back to our own state, right? Louisiana. So for example, thinking about LSU, Louisiana State University, Southern University is a land grant institution. So when LSU got a facility, so did Southern. Now, the quality of the facility at Southern and of these other Black colleges, they weren't up to par, but they did get something. And really that was the argument, is that they're providing the bare minimum. So just throw that out there. And with a lot of Black colleges, because there was that unequal footing, there was a lot of struggling for resources. There wasn't too much funding within HBCUs. They were typically understaffed. The facilities were very limited. So you had a lot of people going in, enrolling in these Black colleges. And as far as the structure of HBCUs, you had a lot of staff being overworked. There was a lot more on their caseload, or really teaching load, and also for lower salaries and fewer benefits compared to like those of like PWIs. And for your information, PWI is a predominantly white institution. Louisiana Tech is a PWI. Grambling State University is an HBCU. So at that point in time, you had teachers who were teaching at these HBCUs, but they were experiencing a lot of stress. And given these, given like the lack of resources or the struggle for them, you had teachers doing what they got to do to pass, to not pass, but um, to make most of the information of the curriculum. So when it came to teaching psychology, that was exactly what was going on. So remember when we talked about the teachings of psychology to white students, white psychology students, there was this emphasis on instrumentation and laboratory experiments. Well, within HBCUs, there wasn't too much of an emphasis on that. Um, Instead, it was more about the applied parts of psychology. What you also saw was like this de-emphasis on the hereditary basis for differences. So compared to a PWI, teaching psychology consists of teaching similarities between people, and understanding where these differences in IQs come from. And a lot of professors who did teach psychology, they made this emphasis about um, inequality as being part of it. The lack of educational equity and opportunity um, provided that that difference in IQ between people. So as they were doing the work, they were promoting the recognition of social injustice, right? Because at that point in time, you had this research coming out about Black and Brown peoples being less intelligent than white folks. Uh, but you had the Black anthropologists and Black scholars that were saying, hold on, it's not all the way true. There's more to it than just genetics. It's your environment. It's what you're given in that. And that's what a lot of these psychology courses taught. So there was like a very, very, very big interest in psychology amongst Black students, but the issue was that it wasn't offered in every college. Out of all the HBCUs that were talked about in the chapter, only about 4 of them had offered psychology. And Ermin G. Cannady's study uh, provided us with a lot of information about psychology within HBCUs. So really 14 out of like the total 50 at that point in time had psychology departments. And when it came to psychology as like a major subject, only 4 of them offered that. So as a major, only 4 offered psychology there. Okay. Um, Now the courses, what Canady recognized were more so about like um, applied work and so forth and so on, but like they really didn't focus on um, this field of race psychology, which you had a lot of white psychologists engaging, but there wasn't too much talk about that at these HBCUs. There wasn't too much talk about that in those psychology courses. And so he was calling on um, for a particular Black psychology. So as these studies were going on about, or really as the survey went on, you had a lot of people wanting to learn more about psychology, and one way to do that is by reading about it. Now, when it came to library and research facilities, donations were like a very big part in the construction of these. So the Carnegie Corporation and Julius Rosenwald, they're very big funders for these libraries. And with these contributions to these facilities, it called to attention to um, like the training of librarians and psychology professors as well. So with these libraries, you had access to these different journals. So like you had um, different journals being published and disseminated into these libraries. And what there was there was a recognition that a lot of psychology professors in Black colleges, they did not publish. So your book only says that only 8 psychology professors, 3 of whom were white, out of the total 88 psychology professors throughout Black colleges, reported having published research. This is a big deal. So when it comes to research, what we found in the earlier chapters, if you publish a work, not only do you get recognition, but your work is your information. Excuse me, the results of your work are being read and disseminated to other people. So this fuels people's perception, provides them information about these different psychological concepts. Now, when it came to Black psychology professors, or professors who were teaching in Black colleges, the impact around the lack of funding, as well as the heavier teaching load, contributed to psychologists' research. Of note, also the lack of graduate training as well. So when it comes to employment opportunities at that point in time within psychology, as a whole, it was very, very limited. Psychologists at that time it was a very prestigious occupation, and only so few people got into it. But notably, there were some Black psychologists who reached that level. Lily Brushwing Study, she was a white psychology professor at an HBCU. Her own students were expressing like an interest in psychology as a career. So what she did, she sent out a questionnaire, and with this questionnaire, you had Black professionals trained in psychology at the time answer it. So of note, while it wasn't, what you did notice is that as a whole, when it came to really forwarding people's research, engaging as a psychologist at that point in time, there wasn't a lot of opportunities. But the thing about it is, if you think about that time frame, there really wasn't a big call to psychology at that time. However, one person's not one, but what was notable about about the results of Brushwing's study, well, questionnaire in particular, was that there was like a larger amount of representation of Black women who found employment in the profession of psychology at that time. Now, a larger number of Black women graduated from college than Black men at that time. But something just to take note, it still was few. To be quite clear, psychology as a whole was, well, within academic research, very, very limited, very prestigious. But then you also had the clinical psychology, well, I'm not saying clinical psychology as the field, but the applied part of psychology, that wasn't being called on either. So there was very limiting opportunities for Black professionals in psychology. Um, but it wasn't until there were studies being done on uh, the impact of segregation, so forth and so on, that people started to recognize like how Black psychologists are where the opportunities lied for Black psychologists. Um, so your book talked quite about a lot of different things in here. Um, but the point is, well, really with the book, it documents the role that psychology played in the subjugation of African slaves, and also how it stemmed an interest in Black not graduate students, but um, just Black students, college students, undergraduate students and graduate students alike. Uh, and in the next chapter, they're going to talk quite a bit about training Black psychologists at that point in time. So that's all I have for you at this for this particular review of chapter 5. Please make sure if you have any questions to email me.